The morning air carried the faint chill of early spring, the kind that hinted at change without quite delivering it. Mark Sullivan stood at the edge of his driveway, sipping his coffee, surveying the concrete strip that stretched from his garage to the quiet suburban street. It wasn't anything special, just a long, clean stretch of driveway that sloped slightly downhill. It was practical, functional, and perfectly maintained. At least, that's what Mark thought. He had poured that driveway himself, years ago when the neighborhood was new and the HOA had only recently formed. It was his pride, a project he had saved for, designed, and executed with precision. The extra length gave him space to park his boat during the summer, room for his teenage son's car, and a buffer between his house and the bustling street. It wasn't flashy or unusual, just longer than most. But that morning, as he approached his truck to head to work, he noticed something tucked beneath his wiper blade. A crisp, folded paper, printed in the HOA's familiar blue and white letterhead. The words were sharp and sterile, the kind that carried false politeness but real authority. The HOA, it claimed, had received multiple complaints regarding the nonconforming length of his driveway. According to updated neighborhood regulations, driveways could extend only a specific distance from the garage before being considered aesthetic disruptions. He was instructed to submit a correction plan within 30 days, or face fines and potential legal action. Mark reread the letter 3 times before setting it down on the hood of his truck. The absurdity of it was almost laughable. Too long? Since when was a driveway's length a problem? His was on his property, fully permitted, inspected, and even part of the original home plan. There was no encroachment, no safety issue, just another HOA nitpick, fueled by nosy neighbors and an overzealous board. But beneath the frustration, there was something else, a flicker of defiance. It wasn't the first time the HOA had targeted him. Last summer, they'd cited him for having non-regulation trash bins, and before that, for leaving his boat in the driveway for more than the approved 48-hour window. He'd complied grudgingly every time, but this was too ridiculous to ignore. Later that day, he drove through the neighborhood, eyeing other homes. Dozens of driveways varied in shape and size, some longer than his, some shorter, a few cracked and unkempt. Yet, none of them had notes on their windshields. It was clear the rule wasn't about uniformity, it was about control. And control in this neighborhood had a name: Margaret Hensley, better known as Karen, behind closed doors. Margaret, the HOA president, had lived across the street from Mark for nearly a decade. Her manicured front lawn looked like it belonged on a magazine cover, and she treated every deviation from perfection as a personal insult. She had complained about kids' chalk drawings, mismatched mailboxes, and even Christmas lights that stayed up too long after the season. Her word was law in Maplewood Estates, and she wielded it with pride. That evening, as Mark stared at the letter again, an idea began to take shape. He could fight the fine through official channels, file paperwork, attend meetings. But what good would that do? The board was stacked with Margaret's allies. No, this needed a different approach. Something that would make a statement. Something that would make her realize how absurd the rule truly was. He thought about his driveway, the stretch of concrete that had somehow become a battleground. If they thought it was too long now, what would they do if it were even longer? The thought made him smile. The next weekend, while the neighborhood slept late, Mark rented a small cement mixer and got to work. He expanded the edges of his driveway a few more feet, just enough to make it noticeable. By mid-afternoon, he'd added a clean new section of concrete, blending it perfectly into the existing structure. It extended nearly to the edge of his yard, stopping just before the sidewalk. The reaction came faster than he expected. By Monday morning, Margaret was standing at the end of his property, arms crossed, phone in hand. Her eyes widened as she inspected the fresh concrete. She didn't say a word to Mark, just snapped a picture and marched away. That same afternoon, a new letter arrived. This one was angrier, citing willful noncompliance and threatening escalating penalties. Mark barely finished reading before tossing it onto the kitchen counter. He wasn't finished yet. If they wanted a problem with his driveway, he'd give them one worth talking about. Each weekend after that, he expanded it a little more, always within his property lines, always perfectly legal. A few feet here, another section there. By the end of the month, his driveway curved gracefully around his yard, looping back toward a side gate that led to his backyard. It looked almost like a private lane. Neighbors started noticing. Some laughed quietly when they saw him working, others gave him thumbs up from across the street. A few whispered that he was going too far, but most admired the boldness. It was rare for anyone to stand up to the HOA, especially Margaret. But she wasn't amused. The next week, she called an emergency HOA meeting. Mark didn't attend. He didn't have to. He already knew his name would be on every agenda item. He could almost picture her face, red with frustration, waving photos of his control driveway as evidence of neighborhood decay. He didn't care. His driveway was more than concrete now. It was a message. When he finally checked his mail again, he found a notice taped to his door. This one was the harshest yet, threatening daily fines, possible legal injunctions, and even mention of property liens if he didn't comply. Mark read it slowly, smiled, and walked back down his driveway. The one they said was too long. The sun reflected off the smooth surface, bright and unbroken, stretching far across his property. It wasn't just a driveway anymore. It was defiance, poured and hardened for everyone to see. And in that quiet moment, as he set the letter on the hood of his car, Mark made a decision that would turn the entire neighborhood upside down. If they thought this was long, they hadn't seen anything yet. Mark woke up early the next Saturday, long before the neighborhood stirred. The air was damp from overnight rain, and the scent of wet earth mixed with the faint bitterness of cement dust that still lingered from last weekend's work. His boots crunched on gravel as he surveyed the stretch of concrete that now wound elegantly through his yard. It wasn't just a driveway anymore. It was a statement. But for Mark, it was far from finished. The new section had changed everything. The HOA's frustration only fueled his determination. They wanted him to shorten it, to conform, to erase his individuality in favor of uniformity. Instead, he'd do the opposite. He'd turn his so-called non-compliant driveway into a masterpiece of absurd proportions, a monument to defiance. He spent the morning marking out new boundaries with orange flags and chalk lines, tracing curves that hugged the edge of his property like a racetrack. Each turn was intentional, designed to make it more elaborate and more visible from the street. By mid-morning, the low rumble of a cement truck echoed down the block, and heads began to appear from behind curtains. Margaret's blinds twitched. The truck backed into position, and the workers stepped out, confused but unfazed. Mark handed them the plan, a simple, clear request for another concrete extension. They shrugged, mixed, and poured, shaping the gray river that flowed seamlessly into the existing structure. The rhythmic scrape of trowels and the hiss of water filled the air as neighbors gathered to watch. By late afternoon, a new curve shimmered in the sunlight, doubling the driveway's width and adding a gentle arc toward his backyard gate. It was beautiful in a ridiculous kind of way. From her porch, Margaret watched in disbelief. Her lips moved silently, counting the feet, the angles, the potential violations. By evening, she was on her phone again, pacing her lawn with the energy of someone plotting a war strategy. The next morning, another notice appeared on Mark's door, this one thicker, more official looking. It referenced unauthorized expansion, violation of neighborhood aesthetic guidelines, and intentional disregard for compliance orders. The fine had doubled. Mark read the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it under one of his lawn gnomes, his new filing system for HOA correspondence. He didn't bother responding. Instead, he began drafting plans for the next phase. If they thought a looping driveway was bad, they were about to witness something unforgettable. Over the next few weeks, Mark's project became the neighborhood's favorite spectacle. Every Saturday, trucks arrived carrying cement pavers, decorative stones, and lighting fixtures. The driveway began to branch off, first one arm leading to his side yard, then another that curved elegantly behind his garden shed. The path twisted like a maze, always within property boundaries, always just barely within code. Kids on bicycles started riding through it after school, weaving between the curves. Joggers began using it as a convenient shortcut. Neighbors came by with coffee mugs just to see the progress. It was impossible to ignore. Margaret's frustration reached new heights. She began sending out HOA newsletters with highlighted sections on community unity and visual harmony. She posted reminders about property maintenance and compliance. She even stood at the end of her driveway during construction, camera in hand, documenting every inch of progress. Mark didn't confront her. He didn't need to. His silence said more than words ever could. One afternoon, a local real estate agent drove through the neighborhood and stopped in front of Mark's house. She got out, stared, then took photos. "What on earth is that?" one of the nearby neighbors whispered. By the end of the week, a photo of Mark's driveway had gone viral on a community Facebook group titled Maplewood Madness. The caption read, "This guy's driveway is longer than some streets." Legend. The comments exploded. Some called it art. Others called it insanity. But everyone was talking about it. Even people from nearby neighborhoods began driving through Maplewood Estates just to see the infinite driveway. Some joked that it should have its own street sign. Local teenagers filmed TikToks doing laps around it, adding dramatic music and captions like, "When HOA rules go too far." Margaret, of course, was livid. She called another emergency HOA meeting, this time with a city zoning officer in attendance. The room was filled with tension, whispers, and the faint hum of ceiling fans. Margaret presented her evidence, dozens of photos, copies of the OA's letters, and a list of complaints from anonymous residents. The zoning officer listened patiently, flipping through the documents, occasionally glancing up at the photos. When he finally spoke, his words hit like a hammer. Mark's driveway, though extensive, technically violated no laws. It was built within his property lines, adhered to city codes, and had no safety infractions. The HOA's rules were aesthetic guidelines, not legal mandates. The look on Margaret's face, according to one attending neighbor, was priceless. But the meeting didn't end there. She vowed to find another way to protect the character of the neighborhood. She called for a special committee to review all home modifications, hoping to trap Mark in some obscure clause. When Mark heard about it, he only smiled. He had already planned his next move. If the HOA wanted to play bureaucracy, he'd respond with creativity. He began lining the driveway with solar lights, each one glowing softly at night, tracing the endless loops of concrete like a private runway. He added decorative stones, edging, and even a small fountain at one curve. It became more than a driveway. It was art, defiance, and performance all rolled into one. Visitors came daily to see it, snapping photos and asking questions. Local news outlets began catching wind of the driveway that wouldn't end. Reporters reached out. Mark politely declined interviews but didn't stop anyone from filming. By the time summer arrived, his home was a local landmark. And Margaret's once pristine, rule-perfect neighborhood had become famous for the very thing she despised: one man's refusal to conform. But Mark wasn't done yet. He had one final addition in mind, something that would cement his victory forever, both literally and figuratively. He stood at the end of his sprawling driveway one evening, watching the sunset reflect off the smooth surface. The golden light shimmered like water, and for a moment it felt peaceful. But peace wasn't what this was about anymore. This was about making a point so bold, so impossible to ignore, that even the most controlling HOA would have to admit defeat, and Mark already knew exactly how to do it. By midsummer, the driveway had become more than just a neighborhood curiosity. It was a phenomenon. What began as a small act of rebellion had turned into a spectacle that not only redefined Mark's property, but reshaped the neighborhood's reputation. Cars slowed down every day, people filmed short videos, and even the mail carrier chuckled as she maneuvered through the winding path to deliver packages. But with attention came pressure. The HOA, under Margaret's relentless push, doubled down on their efforts to contain what they called a neighborhood blight. Flyers appeared on doors reminding residents of community standards. A petition circulated, urging homeowners to restore visual order to the neighborhood. Margaret herself began patrolling daily, clipboard in hand, taking photos and muttering under her breath about urban sprawl. She was no longer content with sending warnings. She wanted Mark gone. One morning, Mark returned home from running errands to find a new letter taped to his door. It was longer than the others, printed on official letterhead, signed by Margaret herself, and stamped with the HOA seal. It wasn't just a fine this time. It was a formal notice of hearing for potential termination of residency privileges. Mark read it twice, his jaw tightening. The HOA couldn't actually evict him, of course. He owned his property. But the language was aggressive, meant to intimidate. They accused him of willful noncompliance, causing disruption, and bringing disrepute to the neighborhood. He laughed quietly and set the letter aside. By now, he had learned that the HOA's power came from fear, and fear was something he no longer had. So he decided to double down once again. The next weekend, while Margaret was away attending what she proudly called a regional HOA leadership summit, Mark broke ground on the next phase of his plan. He called it Driveway Phase 3. Though to outsiders, it looked more like an outdoor art installation than a construction project. He expanded the final loop into a circular turnaround, lined with decorative stones and embedded LED strips. But the centerpiece was what made it legendary. A giant compass rose poured directly into the concrete, painted in bold colors with the words Freedom Drive, etched across the top in polished steel letters. It was symbolic, dramatic, and completely unmissable from the street. By the time Margaret returned, it was already trending online. A drone shot had captured the entire pattern, gleaming under the sun. Surrounded by perfectly manicured grass, the post went viral with thousands of shares, and hashtags like Pay Freedom Driveway and Fight Homeowner spread across social media. Local news stations began calling it the most defiant driveway in America. But while the internet loved it, the HOA's fury grew. Margaret immediately scheduled another emergency board meeting, this time behind closed doors. Residents speculated wildly. Some whispered that she planned to sue. Others said she was contacting county inspectors to find something wrong with the project. Anything. Meanwhile, Mark kept working quietly, installing a motion-activated fountain at the center of the compass rose. At night, it glowed blue and gold, the water shimmering across the engraved letters like a beacon. Cars began parking across the street to take photos. Children laughed as they rode scooters around the loops. Even delivery drivers started using it as a U-turn point. The HOA's attempts to paint it as an eyesore were failing miserably. The community adored it. Then came the inspection. One humid afternoon, 2 men in reflective vests arrived, city code enforcement officers. They walked the property slowly, measuring, taking notes, checking drainage lines. Margaret trailed behind them like a shadow, pointing, complaining, gesturing wildly at the endless pavement. Mark watched from his porch, calm and unbothered. He already knew the outcome. After nearly an hour, the inspectors packed up their tools and walked over to him. They confirmed what he'd known all along. Everything was within code. Proper runoff, no encroachment on public land, safe slope gradient, legally flawless. Margaret's voice cracked as she protested. The officers politely reminded her that city regulations did not enforce aesthetic uniformity. They left shortly after, leaving her standing on the edge of the driveway, defeated and trembling with rage. That night, Mark received an anonymous letter in his mailbox. The handwriting was uneven, hurried. It read, "You think you've won, but you're making enemies. Watch your back." He didn't need to guess who it was from. Days later, tire tracks appeared across his lawn. Trash cans mysteriously tipped over. His mailbox was dented. Little acts of spite, all adding up to a clear message the HOA was getting desperate. But instead of lashing out, Mark did what he did best. He built. He reinforced the mailbox with steel and repainted it to match the driveway's compass design. He installed a camera on the front porch, disguised as a bird feeder. And most of all, he began drafting the plans for Phase 4, a project so audacious it would make his driveway impossible to ignore forever. Because at this point, it wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about proving a principle, that creativity, ownership, and individuality had a place even in the most suffocating communities. Mark wasn't just building a driveway. He was building a monument to freedom, one concrete section at a time. And soon, the HOA would realize that their war had only fueled his legacy. As summer gave way to autumn, the neighborhood around Mark's house no longer looked like the quiet suburb it once was. Every day, strangers drove slowly past, gawking at the bold geometric masterpiece that wrapped around his property. The circular driveway glistened after every rainstorm, the metallic lettering catching the sunlight like a badge of rebellion. What had started as a small act of defiance had become a landmark. Not just online, but in real life. The HOA's pristine world of beige and conformity was cracking. Margaret, the HOA president, was unraveling. Her perfect hair and composed demeanor had been replaced with exhaustion and paranoia. She patrolled daily, muttering to herself, snapping pictures of every minor violation she could find, from slightly overgrown hedges to mailboxes with unapproved colors. She had lost sight of the community's purpose now. It was just about control. But Mark had found a new purpose of his own. The success of Freedom Drive had awakened something creative in him. He realized his driveway wasn't just a statement, it was a foundation. So, he decided to turn it into a full-fledged art installation. He filed a simple permit with the county, labeling the next project as decorative landscaping, a term vague enough to keep the HOA guessing. Then he began construction on what he called the Monument of Defiance. It started with a massive concrete archway installed at the entrance of his driveway, smooth, modern, and towering high enough for a truck to pass beneath. Embedded in the center of the arch was a motion sensor that triggered a soft amber glow at night. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Individuality built here." The neighbors loved it. Kids called it the Gateway. Families took photos beneath it. Even a few of the other HOA members secretly admired it, though none dared to say it out loud. Margaret, however, was livid. She tried everything: noise complaints, zoning appeals, even a desperate attempt to claim the archway violated height uniformity. But each attempt failed. Mark had done his research meticulously. Every dimension, every regulation, every line of code had been satisfied. The HOA board began to fracture under the pressure. Several members resigned, unwilling to be part of Margaret's escalating crusade. Others quietly shifted their stance, arguing that perhaps the HOA had overstepped. But Margaret was beyond reasoning. She saw Mark's creation as a personal humiliation, and she wasn't going to stop until it was erased. One afternoon, she appeared at Mark's property with a man in a suit, her newly hired attorney. They spent hours pacing the sidewalk, pointing at structures, taking photos, reviewing paperwork. She was clearly preparing for something big. Mark didn't need to wonder what. He knew she was planning a lawsuit. But he was ready. He had been keeping detailed records of every interaction, every letter, every petty act of retaliation. He had timestamps, witnesses, and even security footage of Margaret trespassing on his property. So, when the HOA finally filed their complaint claiming architectural defiance, community disruption, and property devaluation, Mark responded with his own, a counterclaim for harassment, defamation, and abuse of power. The HOA board was stunned. For the first time, someone was fighting back, legally, confidently, and with undeniable evidence. The news of the lawsuit spread quickly. Reporters returned, neighbors whispered, and social media reignited the fee freedom driveway trend. This time, though, the narrative was even more powerful. One man standing up to an oppressive OA system that had forgotten its purpose. Margaret's carefully crafted image began to crumble. At the next OA meeting, attendance doubled. Residents, once afraid to speak out, voiced their frustrations. They brought up old grievances, unnecessary fines, rude letters, arbitrary rules. Margaret tried to keep order, but the room had turned against her. When Mark arrived, calm, collected, carrying a simple binder, the tension in the room was electric. He presented his evidence with precision, detailing every violation of privacy, every overreach, and every intimidation attempt. The audience listened in stunned silence. When he finished, several board members resigned on the spot. The COA's lawyer requested an adjournment, clearly unprepared for what they were up against. That night, Margaret's porch light remained off for the first time in years. The next morning, her usual patrol didn't happen, and by the end of the week, word spread that she had stepped down as OA president. But Mark didn't celebrate immediately. He knew that while Margaret might have lost her title, the system she represented was still in place, rigid, outdated, and hostile to change. So he decided to go one step further. At the next HOA election, when the call for nominations went out, Mark's name appeared on the ballot. Many thought it was a joke at first, but when voting day arrived, the results were overwhelming. Mark won. The man the HOA had tried to crush was now its new president. Standing at the next meeting, he announced sweeping reforms, simpler rules, community input, and an end to aesthetic micromanagement. He promised to make the neighborhood about living, not control. For the first time in years, the residents applauded. Freedom Drive was no longer a rebellion. It had become a symbol, a reminder that even in the most restrictive environments, one person's determination could spark change. But as Mark stood outside that evening, the arch glowing softly behind him, he noticed a single car parked across the street. Margaret's car. She was watching silently from the shadows. He didn't know what she was planning, but something told him the war wasn't quite over yet. Weeks passed since the election, and peace finally began to settle over the once hostile neighborhood. The air felt lighter, the meetings calmer, and for the first time in years, the residents could decorate, garden, or park their cars without fear of a fine appearing on their doorstep. Mark's leadership had transformed the community. The OA's reputation, once synonymous with oppression, was now slowly being rebuilt. He introduced transparency. Every rule, every vote, and every financial record was now publicly available. Residents were encouraged to submit improvement ideas instead of complaints. Even children, who once played in hushed tones, laughed openly in the streets again. Freedom Drive had become not just a driveway, but a destination, a beacon of progress. But deep beneath that surface calm, a shadow was stirring. Margaret had disappeared after her resignation, but rumors about her circulated constantly. Some said she had moved to another HOA to start over. Others whispered she was gathering evidence to destroy Mark's reforms. But no one really knew, until the first letter arrived. It came in a crisp white envelope, stamped with the logo of a newly formed community preservation group. It wasn't addressed to Mark personally, but to the entire neighborhood. The letter claimed that the HOA's new policies had caused property values to decline, and that the architectural integrity of the community was being threatened. It urged residents to restore order by signing a petition to dissolve the current board. The name at the bottom was unmistakable: Margaret L. Waverly. At first, few took it seriously. Most residents tossed it in the trash, laughing at the idea of going back to the way things were. But Margaret was not just relying on letters. She had a strategy. One by one, she began targeting the residents who felt left out or overlooked by the new system. The ones whose concerns hadn't been fully addressed, or who still missed the strict uniformity that had once defined the neighborhood. She whispered promises of restoring dignity and cleaning up the chaos. Within weeks, Margaret had gathered a small but vocal group of supporters. They began attending HOA meetings again, sitting in the back watching, taking notes. Mark noticed immediately. He could feel the tension return, the same quiet judgment that once filled every meeting hall. Only this time he wasn't intimidated. He had earned the community's trust. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was planning something bigger. And he was right. Late one night, a series of anonymous complaints were filed against Mark's property. They weren't from the HOA system, but from the county's zoning department. Someone had reported his driveway expansion as an unpermitted commercial use. A follow-up report alleged that Freedom Drive was attracting too much traffic, causing environmental disruption. The claims were thin, but enough to trigger an investigation. Inspectors appeared at Mark's property within days, measuring, photographing, and asking questions. He realized then that Margaret's war wasn't over. It had just changed shape. She was attacking from the outside, using bureaucratic channels she once abused from within. It was a game of patience and paperwork now, and Margaret had decades of experience playing it. Mark spent countless evenings poring over documents, crafting responses, and consulting with lawyers. The process was exhausting, but he refused to give in. He knew her end goal wasn't just to take down his driveway. It was to reclaim control over the entire community. But Mark wasn't fighting alone anymore. The neighbors, the very people Margaret had once ruled with fear, began showing up to help. One brought coffee to his porch every morning. Another printed signs that read, "Keep Freedom Drive alive," and planted them along the streets. Families donated to his legal fund, and a local news station even aired a follow-up piece titled, "Oh, a Hero Under Attack." Public sentiment turned sharply against Margaret. Her small group of followers dwindled as people realized her intentions were rooted not in community preservation, but vengeance. Still, she didn't stop. One afternoon, Mark came home to find a thick envelope on his porch. Inside was a formal notice. Margaret had filed a personal lawsuit against him, claiming his driveway and archway caused emotional distress and irreparable aesthetic damage to the neighborhood. It was absurd, but it forced him into court again. The case dragged on for months. Margaret's obsession became visible. She attended every hearing, glaring, smirking, and occasionally interrupting proceedings with emotional outbursts. She presented photographs of Mark's property as though they were evidence of a crime. But every time, Mark's calm professionalism and solid documentation dismantled her claims. Eventually, the judge had enough. The case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Margaret could never file it again. And when the gavel fell, she didn't move. She just sat there, hollow-eyed, as though the fight had finally drained her completely. After the hearing, she walked out without saying a word. Weeks passed, and Margaret was gone again. This time, truly gone. Her house went up for sale quietly, her car disappeared from the driveway, and her name vanished from all HOA records. But Mark didn't feel triumphant. Instead, he felt something closer to pity. He realized Margaret wasn't just a villain. She was a reflection of what the HOA had become: rigid, fearful and obsessed with control. Her downfall was proof of what happens when rules replace reason and conformity replaces community. That evening, standing at the entrance of Freedom Drive, the golden glow of his archway lit the pavement like a quiet promise. The neighborhood was finally free, or so he thought, because as he turned to head inside, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Enjoy your freedom while it lasts." The sender's name wasn't visible, but the tone, the cold precision of those words, told Mark exactly who had written them. Margaret wasn't finished yet. The message haunted Mark long after he read it. He told himself it was nothing, a desperate final bluff from someone who couldn't let go. But deep down, he knew Margaret wasn't the type to fade quietly. Every victory he'd earned seemed to come with the uneasy certainty that she'd try one last move, one final attempt to reclaim what she thought she'd lost. Weeks passed with no sign of her. The neighborhood thrived, lawns were green and diverse, children rode bikes freely, and the HOA's meetings had turned into friendly gatherings with food and laughter. Freedom Drive had even gained attention online. Influencers visited to film videos about the neighborhood that fought back, and local news stations called it a modern example of community resilience. But beneath the pride, Mark felt the lingering tension of a storm waiting to break. It came one evening, just before sunset, when he saw a black sedan idling near the end of his driveway. It wasn't anyone he recognized. Tinted windows, engine running, the kind of car meant to observe without being seen. It stayed there for almost 10 minutes before slowly rolling away. 2 days later, it was back again. The sightings grew more frequent. Sometimes parked, sometimes moving slowly past the house, sometimes at night. At first, Mark brushed it off as paranoia, but when his security cameras caught the car stopping in front of his property with someone stepping out, a short, blonde woman with a familiar posture, the truth hit hard. Margaret was back, but she wasn't alone this time. Through weeks of quiet investigation, Mark learned that she had teamed up with a small but well-funded law firm specializing in community restructuring. Together, they had filed an appeal to the county planning board, claiming Freedom Drive violated public safety and visual integrity ordinances. The appeal sought not only to have the driveway removed but to impose heavy fines for noncompliance. If approved, it could bankrupt him and destroy everything the neighborhood had built. Mark refused to panic. Instead, he doubled down. He organized a campaign that united the residents once more. They signed petitions, gathered testimonials, and produced aerial footage showing how his driveway had become a point of pride, not a nuisance. Home values had risen, not fallen. Local traffic data showed no increase in accidents or disturbances. He compiled it all into a detailed, ironclad report. And when the county hearing date arrived, the room was packed. Margaret was there, too. She sat near the front, surrounded by men in suits, her expression smug and confident. For the first time in months, she looked powerful again, as if she had rebuilt her throne from ashes. The hearing began with formalities, then moved to arguments. Margaret's attorneys spoke with polished aggression, presenting carefully edited photographs that painted Freedom Drive as an illegal expansion project. They claimed Mark had manipulated community sentiment and intentionally disrupted neighborhood uniformity. But when it was Mark's turn, the tone shifted entirely. He didn't rely on emotion or theatrics. He simply told the story, how a driveway had become a symbol of community, how people had come together to resist overreach, and how rules meant to protect had once been used to control. Then he presented evidence, page after page of data, testimonials, and public support. When he was done, the room fell silent. Even the board members exchanged looks that spoke louder than words. Margaret's expression cracked. For the first time, she realized the battle was no longer about rules. It was about people, and she had already lost them. The board's decision came 2 weeks later. Freedom Drive was declared a non-violative private improvement. Not only that, but the board recommended it as a case study for community-led conflict resolution. The appeal was denied, the fines voided, and all legal claims officially closed. Margaret's law firm quietly withdrew their representation soon after. But the final blow came from the neighborhood itself. Residents began circulating a letter, a formal community statement declaring that Margaret was no longer welcome to own, lease, or represent property within the HOA boundaries. It wasn't legally binding, but the social weight was undeniable. No one would sell to her. No one would welcome her back. Within a month, Margaret's name vanished from local records entirely. Her house in the neighboring district was sold under an alias. Some said she moved to another state. Others claimed she still lurked online, filing complaints anonymously under different names. Mark didn't care anymore. For him, the fight was finally over. On Halloween night, almost a year after the first complaint, he stood at the end of Freedom Drive, watching the lights shimmer down the long path. Families walked by, laughing, admiring the decorations, pumpkins, glowing lanterns, and a wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Freedom Drive," where the rules lost and the people won. It was poetic in its simplicity. The neighborhood had found its balance, not through defiance but through unity. They had learned that communities thrive not under control, but under cooperation. As the night deepened, Mark looked toward the distant horizon, the same direction where Margaret's house had once stood, and felt a quiet satisfaction. Her reign had started with power, but it ended with isolation. His began with resistance, but ended with peace. In the end, it wasn't about a driveway at all. It was about reclaiming ownership of their lives, inch by inch, foot by foot, until freedom stretched further than anyone had dared to imagine. The driveway gleamed in the moonlight, stretching endlessly forward, a perfect metaphor for what they had all built together. It was no longer just a path for cars. It was a statement, a testament, that no amount of rules could ever pave over the will of a united community. And so, as laughter echoed down Freedom Drive, Mark smiled, knowing one truth above all: sometimes, the best way to win against control is simply to keep building forward.